You always hear of forefathers. Well, what about foremothers? America's foundations weren't built solely by men, and one woman challenges that impression with her latest book, Female Adventures: The Women Who Helped Colonize Massachusetts and Connecticut. She's here with me today. She is author Alice Plouchard Stelzer, and she's going to tell me about her book that specifically focuses on women in this area. Thank you so much, Alice.
Oh, thank you for having me. I always love to talk about my book.
That's right. So tell us, you're not talking about, like I mentioned, women in general, but women specifically in the Massachusetts and Connecticut area that were really paving the way for us hundreds of years ago.
Right. And they were women that were totally unknown. I always equated it to a jigsaw puzzle. Find a little information here, a little information there, because they were pretty much in the 1600s unrecorded in the records. Even some of the birth records only say like Samuel, son of, and they give the father's name and never mention the mother. So it took a lot of research.
And I'm sure, especially if it was a female, less information was recorded because back then it wasn't as important to record information about females. We were talking about it off camera, but you mentioned there was even an instance of a prenuptial agreement.
Right.
That came from, what, the 1600s?
Right. Right. It was about, I think, 1635. She was still in England then, but she followed her children over here. And they did prenuptials for different reasons. If they were trying to keep their land when they remarried, or a husband would have to give his wife 1/3 of his household things. And if he didn't want to, he'd make her sign a prenup.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So talk about how you chose the women that you talk about in your book. I'm sure you had many to choose from, but what made you kind of pick these women?
Right. I started with a research form, and when I'd have all the information, I'd decide if they had some part of their life that really added to our knowledge of women's history. And that's pretty much how I tried to have different ages and different income brackets.
So talk about a woman, let's say, from Massachusetts. Give us an example of someone you talk about from Massachusetts.
Well, Massachusetts is Mary Holt. Actually, she ended up in Connecticut, but I'm pretty sure she came from Massachusetts. And she was raped and then brought into court, and she was actually whipped for being raped. And then later on, and what happens, the law then, it went by church law. And the law was that the man who raped her had to marry her. But he was a soldier under a very important person. So suddenly she gets accused of something else. Somebody put his arm around her or something like that. And they banished her right out of town.
Wow.
I can't find where she went or anything.
Very interesting story. Thankfully, nothing like that is happening today. But to even think that something like that could happen hundreds of years ago, right here in the same state that we're living in, it's incredible. And so what are some examples from Connecticut?
Connecticut one I think people find interesting is Thomas Hooker's wife. Of course, Thomas Hooker was very famous. But with all that was written about him, there's very little written about his wife. And she was invalid in some way. I don't know if she was on the ship or not, it didn't seem so, but when they left Cambridge to come to Hartford, because he was the minister of Hartford, she was on a litter for the whole 100 miles, and they walked that 100 miles.
Wow. How did you get into doing this? Like, what brought you to this point where you wanted to write about these women?
Well, I was asked to do some short profiles, and then 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and as I finished each century, I'd give a talk in the community, and everybody really loved them. So a couple of people suggested I do a book, and it seemed like a good idea. I love the research.
What has been the reaction from people when they come and you're on your book talks and you're on, what is the reaction you get from people in the area?
It's been very positive. I'm really pleased. All of my book talks of the people want to stay after and really discuss women's history, and you know, that's very gratifying.
Maybe now women's history is much more public, much more promoted, but a lot of women's history from back hundreds of years ago not very much of it is out nowadays.
No, no. And my problem with a lot of the women's history is it's very generalized under the heading colonial history. And doesn't really address the issues, the sacrifices, the struggles of the first women who came.
And that's kind of where your book
That's right. And when I started the research, it was different. And then about a year in, I decided I wanted to do the most important story. And I thought that was the first generation of women, because they came here to nothing.
That's very true, to a land of nothing with hardly anything.
Right.
And yet they still managed to help build this country.
They did. They set the standard for life in this country for many years.
Is this it, or are you going to continue on?
No, I'm considering ways. I have two dreams. One is that other writers will do similar research and put out more books to broaden our women's history literature. And my second one is to find ways to get this information to children, to the youth of our country, because they aren't getting it in school.
Well, thank you very much for at least promoting this idea.
Okay.
Alice Plouchard Stelzer, thank you.
Thank you.